It's interesting how some Hollywood stories are full of drama that never made it to the screen. The story of Nancy Culp and Buddy Ebsen makes you want to learn more. Before the Beverly Hillbillies put them in the same spotlight, their lives were already full of events that could fill whole books. But what happened before that famous show set the stage for the tension that built between them later on. Let's start with Nancy. She wasn't your typical Hollywood star. She was born in Harrisburg. Nancy Culp was born in Pennsylvania and was the only child of Robert and Marjorie Culp. Her dad was a traveling salesman who was always on the move, and her mom taught and later became a school principal. Nancy grew up in a structured and educated environment. She moved to Miami when she was young and got a degree in journalism. By 1943, she seemed set on a career behind the pen instead of in front of the camera, but Nancy's path wasn't a straight one. She started out writing for the Miami Beach Tropics, a local paper, interviewing famous people like Clark Gable and royalty like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Wasn't exactly small potatoes at the time, but when World War II came calling, Nancy didn't think twice. She quit her studies to join the U.S. Naval Reserve. Picture her young and determined as she earned the rank of lieutenant while serving her country. Now let's switch gears and talk about Buddy Ebsen. Buddy was born and raised in Orlando, Florida, and his dream was to dance. He and his sister Vilma were built as the baby of the stairs, and people loved watching him dance. But life got in the way. When Buddy got to New York, he barely had enough money for a sandwich. He knew he had to hustle, and it paid off. Soon, Buddy was dancing with Shirley Temple and landing roles in musicals. Walt Disney even asked him to help animate Mickey Mouse's moves. But things weren't always so magical. Buddy's career hit a big snag when he was cast as the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz. It sounds like a dream job, right? Well, the makeup they used had aluminum dust in it, and it almost killed him. He ended up in the Buddy did other jobs, like sailing and teaching naval officers during World War II. He may have been laid back, but life had given him his fair share of KNX. Now picture Nancy and Buddy, two people from very different backgrounds, each with their own quirks and drive. By the 1950s, Nancy had moved to Hollywood, gotten married though the marriage didn't last, and started working in the publicity department of MGM. A director saw her and thought she had the face for acting, and soon she was in small roles. Nancy wasn't a leading lady, but her sharp wit and noon attitude made her stand out in scenes. Buddy, on the other hand, was busy making a name for himself on TV. He loved playing folksy, down-to-earth characters that audiences couldn't help but love, and he had already built a reputation as someone reliable and easy to work with, or so most people thought. But here's where things got interesting. By the late 1950s, Nancy and Buddy's paths had started crossing. In the world of TV, they weren't exactly working together yet, but the town wasn't that big. Nancy was known as a smart, hard-working actress who wasn't afraid to say what she thought. Her friend, on the other hand, was known for being more traditional, maybe even a bit old-fashioned, and passionate about his beliefs. Before the Beverly Hillbillies came along, both were looking for work wherever they could. Nancy had a string of guest roles on popular shows. She knew she didn't look like most Hollywood stars, but that didn't stop her. She used her unique style to play strange, memorable roles. Buddy Calm, on the other hand, was alternating between Western dramas and comedies. He wasn't afraid to play darker roles, like bad guys on Gunsmoke and Maverick. By the early 1960s, both of them had made it in Hollywood in their own ways, but neither had found that big role that would make them famous. That was about to change with the Beverly Hillbillies. When the Beverly Hillbillies first came out, it was like a suddenly glitz and glamour surrounded this simple backwoods family. The show was funny, charming, and a little silly, and it hooked millions of viewers week after week. At the center of it all were Nancy Culp and Buddy Ebsen. When the creators of the Beverly Hillbillies were casting, they knew they needed someone special to play Jane Hathaway, the efficient bird-watching secretary who works for Mr. Dale, the Clampett's banker. Nancy was a perfect fit, and Buddy was already well known in the business. Buddy's laid-back personality and ability to play wise fatherly roles made him a natural choice for the role of Jed Clampetts. Jed was the family's rock, a man with little schooling but a lot of common sense. Buddy brought warmth and charm to the role, making Jed someone viewers could trust and root for. When the show premiered, it was an instant hit. People loved the fish-out-of-water story of a family from the Ozarks who strike oil and move into a Beverly Hills mansion. The Clampetts weren't just funny, they were relatable. Their simple ways clashed with the lavish lifestyle of Beverly Hills was full of funny misunderstandings, and Nancy Culp was Miss Jane. Miss Jane wasn't just any secretary, she was smart, loyal, and often the voice of reason when Mr. Dale, her boss, got a little too greedy. She cared about the Clampetts, especially Jed's nephew Jethro, and if you watch the show you know that Miss Jane had a bit of a crush on Jethro. Nancy played her with such a mix of humor and heart that you couldn't help but love her. She was even nominated for an Emmy for the role Buddy's mother. Jed's performance was just as famous. He kept the family together while Granny caused trouble. Ellie Mae charmed everyone with her sweetness, and Jethro messed up one crazy plan after another. Jed stayed calm. He was the voice of reason in a family full of chaos, and his catchphrase, "good doggies," became part of American pop culture. But here's where things get a little complicated. Nancy and Buddy's characters had a warm, friendly relationship off screen. Not so much the tension between them didn't come from the way they acted or. It wasn't just that they were different in how they saw the world. Buddy was politically conservative and didn't hold back from sharing his thoughts. Nancy, on the other hand, leaning more liberal. It wasn't just a difference of opinion, it was a fundamental difference in how they saw the world. Imagine working with someone every day who stands for everything you don't agree with. That's what Nancy and Buddy had to deal with. Other cast members say they'd get into these. There were heated arguments on set that went on for weeks at a time. It wasn't just light teasing or friendly banter, it was serious. Despite the tension, both actors were professional. The show was a huge hit, with millions of viewers every week for a while. It was the #1 show on TV, and its popularity didn't go away quickly. People loved the Clampetts and their antics, and even though Nancy and Buddy might have disagreed in real life, they brought their characters to life perfectly. Nancy's Miss Jane became one of the most loved characters on the show. She wasn't flashy or over the top, but she was likable. She worked hard and tried to do the right thing, but she always ended up in someone else's mess. Her crush on Jethro was meant to be funny, but there was also something sweet about it. In the meantime, Buddy's Jed was the steady hand, helping the Clampetts get through every crazy situation. Whether he was trying to figure out Beverly Hills high society or helping Granny make more moonshine, Jed always kept his cool. Fans watched every week to see what the Clampett family would do next. But despite their success, Nancy and Buddy's relationship never really went away. Some say it got worse as the show went on. It wasn't just politics, it was a clash of personalities. Nancy was smart and wouldn't back down from a fight, while Buddy was charming but could also be stubborn. When those two traits met, sparks flew. It didn't help that the show kept them close as Miss Jane and Jed. They shared many scenes, and while they smiled and laughed on screen, there was a frustration that people who were paying attention couldn't ignore. Donna Douglas, who played Ellie Mae, once said that they'd argue for weeks about their different opinions. Can you imagine how tense that set must have been? But they were professionals, and they didn't let their disagreements ruin the show. That doesn't mean it was easy keeping things civil while working so closely with someone you disagree with takes work, but they did it, and the audience never saw the tension that was bubbling beneath the surface. When the Beverly Hillbillies ended, it had become a cultural phenomenon. People still talk about it today, and its influence can be seen in countless other shows. For Nancy and Buddy, the end of the show didn't mean the end of their story. Their differences would continue to shape how they interacted even after the cameras stopped rolling. In 1984, Nancy decided to go in a completely different direction. She ran for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. She was 62 years old at the time, and some people questioned whether or not she was qualified. Nancy thought she could bring something useful to politics since Ronald Reagan had already done it. She ran as a Democrat in Pennsylvania's 9th Congressional District. It was a tough race from the start because the district was mostly Republican and her opponent, Bud Schuster, had already served 6 terms. But Nancy wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She worked hard to connect with people and share her ideas for change, even though she knew the odds were against her. Buddy Ebsen, who had nothing to do with Pennsylvania or the race, volunteered to record a radio ad for her opponent. In the ad, he called Nancy too liberal and accused her of using her fame to sway voters. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was a personal one. Nancy felt blindsided. She and Buddy had been fighting for years, but this felt like a whole new level of betrayal. When she talked about it later, she said that Buddy had no business getting involved and should have stayed out of it because he's not the kindly old Jed Clampetts that you saw on the show. She said in an interview that she was clearly angry and that even though she and Jed had never gotten along, she would never have done something like that to him. You could hear the hurt in her voice even years later. The ad didn't help Nancy's campaign. In fact, it might have hurt it. She lost the election by a large margin, with her opponent getting more than 66% of the vote. Afterward, Nancy said she didn't blame her friend for her loss, but the pain of what he did stayed with her. She moved away from Pennsylvania. She left for a while to clear her mind and came back only after she'd had time to think about what had happened. Buddy, on the other hand, didn't seem to feel bad about what he did at the time. He stood by what he said about Nancy. But as the years went by, it seems even he started to feel bad about what he did near the end of his life. He said he felt bad about the ad and how their fight had gotten out of hand. Sadly, it was too late to fully mend the relationship by then. Nancy and Buddy didn't talk to each other much after the campaign, and when they did make up, it was for a short time. Nancy found comfort in teaching, which gave her a way to put her knowledge and experience to good use. She became an artist and resided at Juniata College, a small liberal art school in the quiet countryside of Pennsylvania. There, she taught acting classes and inspired many of the students who came through her doors. Her time at Juniata seemed to mark a peaceful chapter in her life, away from the chaos of Hollywood and politics. Nancy found a community that valued her for her insight and warmth. Later, people talked about how much they admired her, not just for her Hollywood fame, but also for her commitment to helping others grow. She brought humor and heart to her lessons, making her students feel like the stage could be a place for everyone, no matter where they came from. It's easy to picture her smiling as she told stories about her time on the Beverly Hillbillies and gave them advice about life on and off the stage. Nancy also performed in local plays and sometimes made guest appearances on TV, so she never really stopped acting. Even after she started teaching, it was clear she still loved acting, and her later work showed a deep appreciation for the power of storytelling. But Nancy didn't just act, she also had a full and active life outside of the spotlight. She had a knack for connecting with people, whether they were her students, friends, or neighbors, and she made the most of her time. In 1990, Nancy faced a new challenge when she was diagnosed with cancer. Despite the news, she was determined to keep teaching and being active in her community for as long as she had to. Friends and coworkers said she was brave and strong throughout her life. She died in 1991, leaving behind a legacy that went far beyond her role as Miss Jane Hathaway. Nye's story was one of persistence, creativity, and refusing to be defined by one chapter of her life. Buddy Ebsen, on the other hand, had his own path in those later years. He stayed in the entertainment industry, but his work slowed down as he got older. After the Beverly Hillbillies ended, Buddy kept acting in movies and TV shows. He was in a popular detective show called Barnaby Jones for several years, which kept him in the public eye, but no matter what he did, people would always think of him in terms of Jed Clampetts. That character, with his homey charm and catchphrase, had become larger than life. But he didn't seem to mind that, at least not on the outside. He enjoyed the love fans had for Jed, even if it meant being cast as the character sometimes. But inside, it wasn't always easy to imagine building a career full of different roles and talent, only to be remembered. For one role, still calm, Buddy handled it with grace. He often went to events and interviews where he happily talked about his time on the Beverly Hillbillies. Later in life, he wrote a memoir in which he talked about Hollywood, his career, and yes, even the famous fight with Nancy. When he wasn't acting, Buddy had plenty to do. He was a good sailor and spent a lot of his free time on the water. He also wrote penning novels, which gave him a creative outlet. In his personal life, Buddy was happily married for a long time to Dorothy, who was not his third wife, and spent his later years with his family. He lived to be an amazing 95 years old and passed away in 2003. By that time, most of his contemporaries had already died, and he was one of the last living links to the golden age of television. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on through the many reruns of the Beverly Hillbillies and the memories of those who had worked with him. People with strong personalities who couldn't find common ground. They were both passionate, talented, and strongly opinionated, and their differences made it hard for them to get along. However, you can't deny the magic they created together on screen, as Jed and Miss Jane made millions of people laugh and feel warm, which is a testament to their professionalism and talent.